Welcome to another episode of This Catholic Life. Conversations about life's ups and downs, big and small, how we deal with every situation imaginable, whatever life throws at us, but still manage to be sensible, practical, and joyful. Today's show is Catholics in Nagasaki. Not many people know that when the second atomic bomb was dropped in the Japanese city of Nagasaki, the Catholic cathedral was almost at the center of the blast. And we're here to talk about that today. I'm your host, Peter Holmes, and today I'm joined by Gwyn McClelland, author of the book Dangerous Memory in Nagasaki and a lecturer in the University of New England. Welcome, Gwyn.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have you here, but before we get started, just a reminder to listeners that if you like the show, you should subscribe on your podcast app, and that way you won't miss an episode. Before we get started, a brief historical context. August 9, 1945, just after 11 a.m., the bomb, codenamed Fat Boy, exploded over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. 60 to 80,000 people, approximately one-third of the population of that city, died from the blast and subsequent damage of the bomb. What's not commonly known is that at the center of the blast, about 500 meters from the center in fact, was the Urakami Cathedral, a Catholic church, and the construction of this church had dated back to 1895. That's when it began, at least. So, firstly, Gwyn, this is your area of study. You've researched this particular Catholicism in Japan and the response to these things. What were Catholics doing in Japan? I mean, if I had to pick a nation, a Christian, I wouldn't have spotted them as a Christian nation. So what was going on there?
Sure. Well, it actually goes right back to the 1500s. We have Xavier. We had like a number of different missionaries arriving in Japan, and there was waves of missionaries, actually, the Catholic missionaries that came in with the Spanish and the Portuguese back then. And then, 250 years of kind of seclusion where Japan shuts down on most foreign trade, and the Christian missionaries are also excluded. But then from the 1860s onwards, then the Catholic missionaries started to come back, and especially the French mission became quite important.
Right. So in the 1860s, the French were there. And so 1895 is still quite some time after that, so 30 years or so. That's when they started building the cathedral. That seems to indicate a fairly solid Catholic presence by then, though. You don't build a cathedral for 3 people.
That's right. So, and what the French missionaries found was that there'd actually been people who had, to some degree, carried on some faith throughout that period of time. And so there was communities, and the community in northern Nagasaki at this time in the 1860s, 70s were actually out of this hidden kind of what scholars started to call hidden Christian communities in the area.
Yeah. Now, hidden Christian is quite literal in that case because they weren't generally known to the authorities, or they weren't advertising the fact that they were Christian for obvious reasons.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the Japanese Catholics actually trace themselves back, and they can, talk about when their communities went into hiding, way back in the 1600s, and sort of look at where they went and how they sought refuge and so on and so forth.
So what were they hiding from? Just briefly, I mean, we want to get onto the actual effect of the bomb, etc., but what were they hiding from back then?
Sure. Well, it began with some waves of martyrdoms. So there was martyrdoms that occurred, and so they were basically trying to hide their faith because Christianity.
People were killing them for being Christians.
Yeah, exactly. So
now, was that a state level persecution, or was it just a local kind of lynch mobbing?
It was state led. So the Tokugawa government arrived in 1601 or 2, and from that point on, Japan became much more united, and so there was a state persecution led by the Nagasaki magistrate.
And were they resisting Christianity because of its Western influence, or were they resisting it on some other grounds?
Well, that's an interesting point, interesting question, because, of course, there was merchants and there was colonialization that happened like in those centuries. And so, what were the motives? It definitely was some fear of the foreigner to some degree. So there was mixed kind of, there was some concerns about what was going on. And but there was also the poor. There was a concern about revolts, and so there was various things going on there. Yeah.
Interesting that Christianity quite often, even right at the beginning, was very appealing to the poor, to the lower, the underprivileged castes, the ones who were slaves, etc. In fact, we have some Roman writings saying that Christians appeal to women and the slaves much more because of the message of equality, of freedom, of those sorts of things. So, not too surprising. Now, there was quite a significant community for Japan in Nagasaki. When the bomb dropped, it seems to have hit most of them. Is that correct to say that most of the Christians were in that 1/3 of people who died in Nagasaki?
Yeah, that's right. So 60 to 70%, in fact.
Wow. And I think I read somewhere that there was a mass, like a very big high mass going on because it was a feast day at the time, and that
Yes.
everybody in that mass was taken.
Yes, I think there were a number of priests who were killed who were actually in celebrating a mass in the cathedral at the time. But of course, now the Nagasaki atomic bomb was actually it was a higher explosion than the Hiroshima case. So people died up to 4.5 kilometers away, compared to in Hiroshima, it was more within a 3-kilometer radius. But because of the valley, the topography of Nagasaki is very different to Hiroshima, and so it was held into the valley, and the Americans had dropped it in the north, which meant that the city itself was somewhat protected.
Right. I'd heard that, and I'd heard that while there was along the valley, there was a lot of destruction, but it was restrained in there. And that was, of course, where lots of Catholics had chosen to live, to be around the cathedral area. So that's why the Christian community took such a hit. Yeah, yes. So it's not a great look in history for the US to be dropping a bomb right on top of a Catholic community. It certainly wouldn't have been the image they wanted. But even now, it's not a popular image. I'm struggled to find this story on the regular history sites. So the question has to come up: what puts a man like yourself on this trail? I mean, clearly you're interested in this history, but what leads you over there to start listening to their stories?
One part of that was, as a child, I was living in Asia, and we met a Japanese missionary family as it happened. And this Japanese family, we couldn't really communicate with them, but the one thing I remember they gave me was a cartoon. It was a cartoon story of Hiroshima, and but it was in English. So that was the thing I could read, and so
wow.
I sort of became fascinated.
Wow. So the cartoon in English from Japan about Hiroshima, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So you were telling me off air that you'd been there and listened to many stories. This is part of and obviously the results of this come out in your book that we mentioned in the intro, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Can you tell us some of the stories, and particularly I'm interested in the effect on the Catholic community, the profound, firstly the immediate effect on the devastation, but then as it unfolds into their faith and their life from then on?
Sure. So I ended up speaking with 12 different survivors, and 9 of them were Catholic survivors. And so I was able to really look into the Catholic story and the Catholic narratives about how they understand the impacts, exactly what you're talking about. So just to give maybe one example for a start, there was a guy, Ozaki Torme, and he was 17 at the time. He was, like most of the 16, 17-year-olds, he was a, advanced high school age student, and so he was put into armaments. So he was building torpedoes in a factory, underground factory. So because he was in the underground factory, he was protected from the explosion. But the lights went out, and so his story was about really emerging from the tunnel, and then what he found, and his world had been turned absolutely upside down. 17 years old, he only had a mother at that stage. His father had died previously. So, of course, his first move was to go home and try and find his mum. And the interesting part about this is he invited me to a hairdresser. And so, what I'm telling you right now, he told me, while he was sitting, getting his hair cut. So I tended to be really just quite impressed by the resilience and, in a way, the matter-of-factness, just the getting down to just explaining what happened. But clearly there was quite a lot of trauma, and so different survivors, depended on who you were talking to, sometimes it would come out. You could really feel it. It was more palpable, and in other cases it wasn't. But so that's one example. He told me about the cathedral. Actually, he spent 17 days or 18 days in the open, and so at night he was just sort of camping on a hill, and he was looking out, and all he could see was the burning cathedral. And for him, this was the absolute, this was the horror of it. And so that was one of his memories that came through.
Well, it's the centre of their Catholic life there, and it represented all of their. They'd built it up fairly recently. It was only, what was that? That was still only less than 50, just over 50 years old, or less than 50 years old.
Well, so it took a long time to build it. They finished it in 1930. Really, okay, I think they put the bells up in 1930. So yeah, so this was the biggest cathedral in East Asia when it was finished.
Right.
So they were extraordinarily proud because I didn't tell you that they were persecuted up to the 1870s. And so, some of the people who had come back from exile, they had photographs of them when the cathedral was finished.
Right.
And these were important. Yeah.
So as the story unfolds, though, you gave us one story there. How did they process this? I mean, how did the survivors even, where is God in such a moment? And how do you rebuild a community?
Yeah. So, there's again, one of the symbols which I sort of examined in my research into Nagasaki and talking with the survivors was the understanding of Mary. And Mary, the statues of Mary which survived the bombing became sort of a symbol of divine presence, I think, that wow. God was with us. and so for me that was quite significant. And I had at least, so there was, I can give you a couple of examples, but one of the survivors said, my dad said to me, he also went, he and his father went looking for his mum. And they spent 3 days, he said, 3 days looking for his mother, couldn't find her. So, there was numbers of people who just were vaporized, disappeared completely, never found. And so his dad said to him, the Ascension of Mary was, I think, the 15th of August.
It was, so in fact, the mass that was being celebrated as the bomb hit was in honor of that feast. So in fact, his father said to him, well, maybe your mum went straight up to heaven. Wow.
Just like Mary, he said. And so for him, that stuck with him. And he was just repeating this to me. He's saying, well, I was trying to understand it, and I just wonder whether my dad was right, or, I don't know if that was true or not, but this was one way that he was trying to work through it.
Now, one of those statues named Agnes of Urakami is in the United Nations, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. So I think just in terms of understanding the significance of atomic weaponry and nuclear weaponry now. So there's a Mary statue as well, which sort of, there's a really fascinating story. But a priest who went to Hokkaido, which is way up in the north of Japan, he apparently was stationed in Nagasaki soon after the bombing. He picked up this statue, and then he ended up in Hokkaido, and for many years it didn't come back. But it eventually came back to the community. And so one of the survivors who I spoke with told me how he helped to establish it as a shrine. And then when Pope Francis came, the one icon that was placed at the front of the Mass, and that was in November last year, in the middle of a baseball stadium, was this particular damaged Mary statue.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. Can you tell us anything about, was there any differences between the Catholic response, the Catholic kind of spiritual response and literary output coming out of that disaster, and the rest of the culture?
Yeah, it is. I think this is an important part of the story, actually, because it's what a lot of people don't realize is that, like you said before, it's quite a difficult story, because the Americans probably aren't really happy about the fact that they bombed the biggest Catholic community in Japan in 1945. So uh, the occupation decided nothing about the atomic bombing was to be told, nothing at all within Japan. So there were stories about what happened, which went around the world, and people talk about. There's a book, I think Hiroshima. I can't remember the name of the book right now, but in terms of Nagasaki, really no one knew anything in Japan until 1952, until the Americans left. And so the Catholic response, in some ways, they had very little to say. They had very little they could say, because, as we know, this was utterly destroyed. Most of them sought refuge in other places. They had to go to family, to Yokohama, all around Japan, and eventually come back. But Nagai Takashi is this guy who was a Catholic doctor, and many people have heard of him. And he was involved in the response, and this, he did a lot of really fantastic things. And I spoke to his grandson. He also then talked a little bit about providence and the possibility that maybe God allowed this to happen so that the war could end, and so that this could be a really important thing. And so the people who died, I think that this was actually a response to other people in Nagasaki saying at the time that you guys worship the enemy god, and so that's why you guys were demolished.
Right. So the Japanese people looked at these Catholics and said, you guys were worshipping that Western god, the one that all the Westerners worship. If only they knew about America. And therefore God was, whoever was destroying them for that. That's profound. It doesn't quite match with Hiroshima. It is interesting that in Nagasaki, as far as I understand, there was only a very small military presence, leaving aside the industrial sort of work that was there, but there was a small military presence, and there were even some prisoners of war, Allied prisoners of war, who went up in the bomb. It's not a good story, morally speaking. And I just, in case the listeners have any ambiguity about this, the Catholic Church has very clearly said that this is a horrendous war crime, and it's not at all permissible morally to target civilians in this kind of way, no matter what the outcome. We can't argue for a sort of a circumstantial or an outcome-based utilitarianism. We have to condemn this kind of targeting of non-combatants as abhorrent and completely immoral. That's not ambiguous. The Catholic Church has always said that, but in terms of their response, seeing God, that I have to say I struggle with that. I don't want to have a go at the people who've actually been through it, but if they're prepared to say, maybe it's a good thing that the war ended, etc., you're still talking about the lives of so many innocent people being sacrificed for that.
Yeah. So I mean, I still had, one survivor telling me, well, I think it might have been actually a good thing that this happened because it did end the war. And, so that there's a lot of ambivalence, and it's not an easy thing to come to terms with. But I think most of the survivors were also talking about Pope John Paul II, because when he came, he, like what you were saying, he made it very clear that this weapon was something from humanity.
Yes.
And actually, many of the survivors were really moved by that statement. And he also said to them, "You've got to talk about it." And so I think one of the reasons that the Catholic community hasn't really told their stories very much until more recently is because they felt, what can we say? Because if God allowed this to happen,
wow.
So
can we say clearly then? Well, I'm going to say, as a Catholic, and as I've studied a little bit of moral theology, but I can say very clearly the Catholic Church does not say that God does evil to achieve good. Sometimes evil happens because evil men do it, and God can work good from that. But God does not do evil to people in order that something good happens. God is not that kind of capricious God, and the people in Nagasaki hadn't angered him in some way, and that's
No, that's right.
That's not theologically correct. There is more involved, though, in atomic destruction than there is in, say, conventional destruction, such as when London was bombed. And we have heard many stories coming out of London, perhaps less, but still some out of Dresden after the Allies bombed Dresden into oblivion. There's still a different sort of flow-on effect from an atomic situation, the damage afterwards, for example. Can you talk about that damage and perhaps even the stigma of having been a survivor of the atomic destruction in the Catholic community?
Yeah, so I think obviously that the radiation, is one of the things which makes it a completely different kind of weapon. But and so there was a whole lot of stigma about that in this particular place. And what I try to bring out in my book as well is that this community was already fissured, that there was already a division. And that
you mean
the
between
Americans
the Catholics and the rest of the community?
Yes, and so actually, what I was mentioning right at the start of the podcast, the martyrdoms tended to happen in this place called Nishizaka, which is right between this place called Urakami in the north, which is where the Catholics are, and then the city. And so you've got kind of a division there, and there is a local philosopher who sort of I followed his lead in understanding how Nagasaki was broken into two parts. So the Americans just made this fissured city more obvious to the local people, so that the Northern Catholic, generally less well off, lower socioeconomic group, they'd been exiled in the 1800s, so they came back and people had stolen their homes and things like that. So they were farming communities.
And they were the ones on which the bomb fell.
And so they're the ones who bore the brunt, basically this marginalised group.
Wow.
So there was an interviewee who told me about how she understood the radiation as germs. People would just say, "You've got germs," basically, to her. So so then when her daughter came to be married, the other family is going, no, well, her daughter is not actually a bomb survivor, but she's the daughter of a bomb survivor, and so maybe she's going to have these germs. Maybe she's going to have the radiation still.
Right.
So this kind of discrimination.
When I looked it up, there's a Japanese term which I'm going to horribly mispronounce. Hibakusha, is that right?
No, that's good. Yeah.
So it refers to, I think you told me before we went on air that it refers to the irradiated, but it's a term used about the survivors. But you're telling me now that there's a kind of a perception that this radiation, this stigma passes through genetics. Wow, that's something hard to bear, which it wouldn't be unique to Catholics. There'd be a kind of a general stigma attached to that.
Yes, that's right. So it wasn't just the Catholic hibakusha in any way. Like, there was definitely discrimination against hibakusha, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki in this way. Yeah.
So what can these people and their experience and their if you like, their stories and their survival and their thriving since, what can they teach us? And in particular, I'm interested in the Japanese Catholic experience, how are they still scattered, or have they regathered, and have they rebuilt the cathedral?
Yes, so they did rebuild the cathedral for one thing. So it took them till 1958. They actually raised the ruins and they put up a new cathedral, and that was very important for them. And so that was one part of the reconstruction. I think it's very different from one to another, but certainly one of the things that I think impressed me the most was that that they'd become, and so hibakusha we've talked about, there's another word called kataribe. Kataribe is a storyteller in Japanese society, so and they became storytellers in the end, that they got to this point of being able to tell their story. And for some of the survivors who I spoke to, the Catholic survivors were often in their 70s before they started to talk about it. And I actually was looking at it through the lens of the biblical story of Job to some degree. And, you know, some of them would talk about their body and how their body was aching. And so still injuries from the atomic bombing. One of them, Nakamura Kazutoshi, he told me that was actually why he ended up talking, because he felt the pain. He started to feel like he was going to die without talking about it. And so he wanted to talk, and he wanted to tell the kids. He wanted to tell the young people.
Literally his pain talking.
Yes.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say, I'm going to read your book now. I'm intrigued. So we're going to put that in the links. Thank you for being our Kataribe, if I pronounce that anywhere near correctly. And
perfect. Yeah.
In many respects, it's very important that goes through various media to the story goes out. Now, however we interpret it, however we struggle with the various events, the experience itself is something we shouldn't lose. We should learn from that, and particularly be inspired by their faith journeys. You told me off air some of the faith stories, and I think that's going to be a much more powerful thing when people, like you said, Job, the classic example of suffering.
Can I give you one last one?
Go ahead.
Ozaki Torme, I think I mentioned him before. He met me in the hairdresser. Well, he decided when he became a brother in a Catholic order that he would take on a new name. And so he named himself, rather than one of the world saints, he chose one of the first 26 martyrs from 1597. And it was a youth, so he was a 16-year-old, and he'd written a letter home to his mother along the way. And so this was a really powerful thing for Ozaki, that his name, and so Ozaki Torme is actually the name of the saint,
right?
The Japanese saint.
Wow.
So I think that's a really
powerful,
really interesting story.
Yeah.
About faith.
Yes. Wow. Well, thank you again. That's it for this week's podcast. If today's discussion got you thinking or wanting to read some more, then you should look in our show notes. But you should let us know. Let us know at thiscatholiclife.com.au, or check us out on any of the social medias such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Discord, and you can find all the links in our website. Be sure to review us on iTunes so that other people can catch up with us. Remember that we're a uniquely Australian Catholic podcast, even if we're looking at the rest of the world through Australian eyes. So we think that's an idea worth getting behind. So tell your friends. Before we go, Gwyn, we normally say hello to someone or shout out to someone at this point. Do you want to say hello to anyone?
I'll say hello to Karen and Geordie and Lydia, who have cheered me on in the writing of the book. So thanks for that.
Good stuff. And I want to say a big hello to two friends who went to Japan, came back from Japan, and got me interested in this kind of thing. And it's really only being there, I think, that they could even relate some of the stories in a way that we can understand. That's all for now. Thank you for listening to This Catholic Life.